Okay, 2 billion. Think about that for a second. It's a genuinely staggering number. Today, that represents the estimated number of followers of Christianity across the globe. But you know what makes that figure so absolutely fascinating? It's the origin story. I mean, how exactly did a tiny, esoteric first-century cult, which was essentially a marginalized minority in the Roman Empire, grow to become the world's biggest religion?
Well, welcome to this explainer. Today we are setting out with a really ambitious goal. We're going to capture the essentials of this book in 8 minutes or less in English, condensing 2,000 years of incredibly dense, dramatic, and world-altering history into a fast-paced narrative. This is going to give you a direct path to understanding how this faith completely shaped the course of human history.
To navigate 20 centuries of history, here is our roadmap. First, from cult to empire. Next, canonizing the Holy Bible. Then, the Great East-West Schism, followed by the Crusades, Inquisition, and Reformation. And finally, the modern Christian era.
From cult to empire, a dangerous reality. For early followers of Jesus, practicing this new faith basically meant living as ultimate outsiders, often being used as convenient scapegoats by Roman authorities.
Now, there's a massive historical paradox here. After the death of Jesus around 30 CE, his followers faced immense, brutal oppression. In 64 CE, Emperor Nero famously blamed Christians for the Great Fire of Rome, which led to horrific public executions. Later, from 303 to 311 CE, you had the Great Persecution under Emperor Diocletian. Christians were stripped of their legal rights, their scriptures were literally destroyed, and their leaders were locked up. But here's the crazy part. Instead of wiping their religion out, this extreme oppression actually fueled explosive growth. By the end of this incredibly brutal period, the faith had grown to over 6 million followers.
And that leads us to a monumental turning point. Emperor Constantine the Great. Influenced heavily by his mother, Helena, Constantine actually became the first Christian Roman emperor. With agreements like the Edict of Milan, he transformed Christianity from a heavily persecuted underground sect into a state-favored religion. Practically overnight, the oppressed were suddenly aligned with the most powerful empire on earth.
Section 2. Canonizing the Holy Bible, defining Scripture. With this newfound imperial power and a massive influx of followers, the Church suddenly faced an urgent need to agree on its foundational texts. So, a really crucial point to understand is that there was never one single original Bible text that just magically fell from the sky. The Bible is actually an anthology. Early church leaders had to carefully select and compile the canon, that is, the official list of divinely inspired Scripture. This was heavily driven by the need to defend the Orthodox faith against completely different alternative interpretations. Take Marcionism, for example. In 144 CE, a man named Marcion proposed a version of the Bible that completely cut away the Old Testament and the Hebrew God. To counter ideas like that, the Church realized, okay, we need to officially define the canon and firmly connect the Old and New Testaments. To further enforce this unity, Emperor Constantine called the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE. This was the first great ecumenical council, and its main purpose was to settle fundamental theological disputes, most notably the debate over whether Jesus was a created being or equal to God the Father. By stepping in to establish Orthodox doctrine, Constantine effectively aligned the powerful engines of the Roman state directly with the Church. They were working together to suppress rival factions and enforce a unified religion.
Section 3. The Great East-West Schism. As the Church's geographic and political footprint expanded, massive internal fractures began to form under the weight of its own immense size.
Following the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476, having distinct political rulers created deep divisions. By 1054 CE, these divisions culminated in what's known as the Great Schism. On one side, you had the Roman Catholic Church in the West, operating primarily in Latin. On the other side, you had the Eastern Orthodox Church, centered in Constantinople and operating in Greek. They just drifted apart, different languages, different customs, and different ideas about authority, permanently splitting the Christian world in two.
While those theological differences might seem kinda subtle to us today, this estrangement eventually escalated into tragic, real-world violence. The hostility between the Greek and Roman churches reached a totally devastating climax when the armies of the Fourth Crusade brutally sacked Constantinople. Over 3 days, civilians were killed, churches were looted, and priceless artwork was completely destroyed, all by fellow Christians. Section 4. Crusades, Inquisition, and Reformation. We are now entering a period where the Church wielded immense institutional power. It's a time that contains some of the religion's most complex and controversial historical conflicts.
Unprecedented political and social dominance led to some highly dramatic events. We see the Crusades, a series of holy wars launched to reclaim Jerusalem. We see the Spanish Inquisition, an extreme institutional effort to root out heresy. We see major clashes with early scientific minds like the trial of Galileo, who was famously twice accused of heresy by the Church. And finally, the Protestant Reformation, a massive religious upheaval that challenged the central authority of the Pope. If we zoom in just for a second on the human scale of the Crusades, you have to realize it wasn't just kings and wealthy knights fighting for territory. Back in 1095, Pope Urban II promised forgiveness of sins for anyone who participated. So more than 60,000 ordinary people, mostly completely untrained peasants, sewed red crosses onto their clothing and marched across the world to the Holy Land. They went deeply believing their participation would erase their sins and grant them salvation.
And we absolutely cannot talk about this era without hitting on the Protestant Reformation. German monk Martin Luther harshly criticized the Catholic Church's sale of indulgences. But what really amplified his critiques and changed the game was a brand new piece of technology, the printing press. This allowed reformers to spread their message rapidly across Europe, which permanently splintered Western Christianity into the several different branches we recognize today.
Section 5. The Modern Christian Era. Adapting to a new world. Let's look at how this ancient institution adapted to the turbulent 20th century, a time of global wars and rapidly changing demographics.
Consider this completely surprising demographic shift. In the year 1900, there were roughly 9 million Christians in Africa. By the year 2000, that number had exploded to 380 million. Following a wave of aggressive missionary work that began in the late 19th century, the religion's center of gravity drastically shifted away from Europe and directly towards the global south, transforming it into a truly worldwide faith.
But while the church saw massive global growth, it also faced intense secularization and serious moral trials back in Europe. The history presents stark realities, like the vastly different roles of the church during World War II. To put in perspective, in 1933, Germany was an almost entirely Christian nation. You had 40 million Protestants and 20 million Catholics, many of whom found traditional religious texts being weaponized to support the rise of the regime. It was a century that deeply tested the moral and social foundations of the faith.
Which leaves us with a pretty profound question to consider. Having grown from a persecuted first-century cult to a global powerhouse of 2 billion people, how will this ancient faith continue to adapt to an increasingly secular, globally connected future? The history of Christianity is quite literally a story of constant transformation, and its next chapter is being written right now. If you enjoyed this, subscribe to In 8 Minutes and never miss what matters.